You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Law and Disorder, where we dive into the world of true crime stories with memorable cases that have lasting effects for law enforcement. Let's hear from Anna Muckenfuss, our Manager of Programs and Education Initiatives, who brings us the story of the People vs. O.J. Simpson, Part 1.
It is 10:25 p.m. on June 12, 1994. Limo driver Alan Parks pulls up to a luxurious Rockingham estate in Brentwood, California, just outside of Los Angeles. Parks is tasked with driving the mansion's occupant to the Los Angeles International Airport for a red-eye flight to Chicago. His passenger appears to be running late. He isn't answering the door. The house appears quiet. Finally, at 11:01 p.m., he emerges. It's Orenthal James Simpson, OJ, or the Juice, a celebrated football star and former Heisman Trophy winner. While he may be retired from his days on the field, he remains a glimmer in the public eye. But something's off about OJ from the moment he enters Parks's town car. He seems flustered and even disorganized. He's sweating profusely and jittery, complaining incessantly about the heat. They are in Southern California, where tropical temperatures are the norm, but it is 11 p.m. and not a particularly warm night. His passenger's behavior strikes Parks as odd, but the driver shrugs it off, chalking it up to their late departure, maybe nerves stemming from the upcoming flight, or even the business he's supposed to participate in once he arrives to the Windy City. He's attending a conference hosted by Hertz Rental Cars, a company where he's a spokesperson. Parks steers the car toward LAX without another thought and delivers his passenger to his flight on time. But across town on Bundy Drive, there is a dog with a plaintive wail that continues for hours. Around midnight, a neighbor walking his own dog sees this distressed animal, a white Akita, standing and howling in front of its gate. Its erratic barking is begging anyone with a pulse for assistance. To any unsuspecting person, it would appear that the dog slipped out of the gate and only required someone's assistant to open it a crack and let it back in. But this neighbor knows this dog and the family that it belongs to. In this safe, relatively quiet, and affluent neighborhood, even at such a late hour, this owner would be out searching for the missing dog, following the sound of its panic-stricken cries to usher it safely home. But tonight, other than the dog's wails, this house appears quiet. A bit too quiet. And as the neighbor draws closer to the dog, his concern begins to grow. The dog's fluffy white fur is stained crimson red, and when he opens the gate, he immediately understands the desperation of the dog's cries, the anguish of its tone. A gruesome scene unfolded before him as he witnessed the bodies of Nicole Simpson and Ronald Goldman laying brutally slain on the front lawn. This discovery by a well-intentioned neighbor would mark the beginning of what would become one of the most sensationalized crimes in American history. It would culminate in what is forever to be known as the trial of the century. This is Law and Disorder. My name is Anna Muckenfuss, and I will be your guide as we dive into the murders of Nicole Simpson and Ronald Goldman, and the search for justice through the climactic case of the People vs. Orenthal James Simpson and beyond. This case gave the entire world a front row seat to one of the most riveting, larger-than-life crime dramas to ever come out of Hollywood. Unfortunately, this case is far from fiction. Not even the most prolific of screenwriters could create as colorful a cast of characters as the players in the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Ito, let alone orchestrate the level of drama and spectacle that took place in that most sacred court of law. So in order to break this story down and analyze it with due diligence, we will be dividing it into two parts. Part 1 will start at the very beginning. We've already set the scene with the discovery of our victims and alluded to some of the key characters, but we want to go a little further. We'll introduce you to the main players, walk you through the investigation, and all of the moving parts that really clash against one another to lead up to that infamous trial of the century. Part 2 is going to focus solely on the trial. This is a courtroom drama in the most literal sense. We will look at the presentation of evidence and discuss the unforgettable, even outrageous witness testimony that unfolded not only in front of the jury and in their absence, but also on televisions across the globe. We will also break down the aftermath of the verdict and catch up with some of the key players to learn how their lives were impacted by this trial. We have a lot of content to cover in our time together, so without further ado, let's commence with part 1. The police are called to Bundy Drive, and the scene is roped off. The victims are officially identified as Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson, and detectives are now tasked with informing their next of kin of their fates. LAPD Commander Keith Boucher orders Detectives Tom Lang, Philip Van Adder, Ron Phillips, and Mark Furman to not only notify Simpson of his ex-wife's death, but also to escort him to the police station to pick up the 2 children that he and Nicole shared. They had been asleep in Nicole's home at the time of the murders, and were now at the precinct while investigators scoured their home for clues to the identity of their mother's murderer. Detectives head to Simpson's Rockingham estate and buzz the intercom. No answer. They attempt to get an answer from someone in the house for over 30 minutes, but no dice. Simpson's white Ford Bronco is in the driveway. Shouldn't that mean someone's home? Detectives have no idea that Simpson had left only a few hours earlier and was now in a Chicago hotel room. Detectives Lang and Furman approach the Bronco, looking for any sign that its owner may be in the house. It's parked at an awkward angle, as if parked there hastily. As they got closer, they noticed blood on the door. Fearing that someone inside the home may be hurt, Detective Van Adder instructed Furman to scale the home's privacy fence and allow the other detectives inside. Later, these detectives would argue that this entry to the property without a search warrant was justified by exigent circumstances. The murder of an ex-wife and need to return children to the custody of a living parent, as well as the fear that someone inside may have been injured, justified their entrance to this residence. Upon their entry to the residence, the detectives did briefly interview the occupant of Simpson's guest house, struggling actor and friend Brian Cato Kalin. He confirmed Simpson's ownership of the White Bronco parked out front and informed detectives that Simpson was indeed away from the property on business. He also mentioned that earlier that night, around 10:40 p.m., he had been talking to a friend on the phone and heard thumps against his wall. After talking to Kalin, detectives scanned the property briefly to investigate what may have been the source of the thumping against the guest house wall. It was during this canvass of the surrounding area that Detective Furman came across something rather suspicious. A black leather glove, right-handed, stained with blood. A glove of similar description had been found at Bundy Drive, laying next to the slain body of Ronald Goldman. The glove at Bundy Drive, though, had been left-handed. Had he just discovered the precarious glove's mate? The evidence of the glove alone, and suspicious thumping against the guest house wall, was determined to be sufficient probable cause to issue an arrest warrant for Simpson. But before Simpson could be arrested, or even charges officially filed, Simpson needed to be back in Los Angeles, and urgently. Unable to inform Simpson of his ex-wife's death while at his home, Detective Phillips gives OJ a call at his Chicago hotel room. The phone call struck Detective Phillips as odd. When informed of his wife's death, OJ did sound upset, but he was relatively unconcerned by the circumstances of her death. Granted, OJ and Nicole were estranged from one another at the time of her murder, their only common ground being the 2 children that they shared. OJ did ask about the children, but he only asked if the children had seen the murder or seen Brown's body. He wasn't concerned about whether the assailants had harmed the children, and this was telling for detectives, even after taking into regard OJ and Nicole's relationship. The pair had had a rather rocky past. While their relationship appeared to fit the glamorous mold of the Hollywood elite, there was a troubled life at home. The New York Times once reported of an incident that occurred on January 1st, 1989, where O.J. had beaten Nicole so severely that she required hospitalization. Police records from their response to the incident describe that Nicole repeatedly shouted, "He's going to kill me," when they arrived on the scene, and she told police that they'd been called to the residence 8 times before the 1989 incident. Simpson even echoed the number 8 in his own confrontation with police that same evening. About the same incident, O.J. was quoted in an LA Times article saying to police, "The police have been out here 8 times before, and now you're going to arrest me for this? This is a family matter. Why do you want to make a big deal of it when we can handle it?" The same article quotes Nicole exasperatedly saying to officers, "You never do anything about him. You talk to him and then leave." O.J. was arrested for the January 1989 incident, and the prosecutor for the case recommended that O.J. spend 30 days in jail and complete a year-long program for men who batter their wives. Unfortunately, neither of these things ever happened, but Simpson did enter counseling with a psychiatrist of his choice. Not much else was published about the encounters between law enforcement and the Simpsons, whose marriage dissolved in 1992, and there's nothing much published about what happened behind closed doors. But excerpts released from Nicole's journals by her family after her death do paint a disturbing picture of domestic abuse and an unhappy marriage. After receiving the news of Nicole's death, O.J. made arrangements to travel back to Los Angeles. He arrived back to his Rockingham estate on June 13th and was greeted by law enforcement combing his property for evidence. He was brought to the LAPD's Parker Center for questioning, and officers notice a cut on O.J.'s left hand, consistent with the location of an injury they believed the killer would have sustained in the grisly action of his crimes. When asked about the injury, Simpson claimed that he accidentally cut his finger in Chicago after hearing of Nicole's death. It was then that Lang informed Simpson of the blood found in the Ford Bronco, and it was at this point that O.J. admitted he had cut his finger at some time on June 12th, but he didn't remember how. Before being released for questioning, O.J. voluntarily gave a sample of his blood for comparison with blood evidence found at the crime scene, specifically droplets of blood found next to some footprints that were exiting the scene believed to belong to the perpetrator. 2 days later, Simpson will hire celebrity attorney Robert Shapiro and task him with assembling what would be known as the dream team of attorneys who would work on Simpson's defense. And then they waited for preliminary DNA results and the possibility of arrest. The district attorney's office had decided to delay in filing charges against O.J. until the results of this DNA testing came back. So O.J. heads to the San Fernando Valley to await the results among friends and his attorneys. He stays with a close friend named Robert Kardashian and his family, and he maintains close contact with his attorney Shapiro, who noted that Simpson was in a purportedly fragile mental state. He calls upon several doctors to attend to his client and treat him for distress and depression. Meanwhile, Nicole's funeral is being arranged for June 16th, and O.J. attends with his 2 children that he and Nicole shared. Before the public funeral, the 3 of them attend the private viewing with Nicole's family. O.J. is rather quiet at the funeral, but during this viewing, he puts on quite the show of emotion at the side of the casket when he thinks no one is looking. This was witnessed by Nicole's mother. She would later testify in court that O.J. leaned down and kissed Nicole's body, and she heard him mutter, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Nick." A chilling moment on a somber day. O.J. did not attend the funeral service for Ronald Goldman. On June 17th, detectives recommend to the district attorney that Simpson be charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstance of multiple killings after the final DNA results come back as a match to Simpson. The LAPD notifies Robert Shapiro of their intent to charge Simpson at 8:30 that morning. They come to an agreement that Simpson will turn himself in to police later that day. Shapiro breaks the news to O.J. at 9:30 a.m. at the home of Robert Kardashian, instructing him that he is due to turn himself in by 11 a.m., an hour after the charges are officially filed. Simpson tells his attorney that he agrees with the decision to turn himself in, and LAPD officers agree with the belief that someone with the celebrity of Simpson will not attempt to evade arrest. After conference with law enforcement, the LAPD even extends the time of Simpson's surrender by an hour in order to allow him to be seen by a mental health specialist, as he was exhibiting signs of suicidal depression. Since hearing the news of his wife's murder, Simpson had updated his will, called his mother and children, as well as written 3 sealed letters, one to his mother, one to his children, and one to the public. At 12 noon, over 1,000 reporters stood in front of LAPD headquarters, awaiting Simpson's perp walk into custody. But Simpson did not show. LAPD contacts Robert Shapiro, notifying them that because Simpson did not show, they will be sending officers to Kardashian's home to arrest Simpson and take him into custody. While Kardashian and Shapiro went to notify Simpson of the change of plan, he was nowhere to be found. Neither was his friend Al Cowlings. All that remained were the 3 sealed letters. Simpson was on the run. At 1:50 p.m., LAPD Commander Dave Gaskin, the agency's spokesperson, publicly declares Simpson a fugitive, and police issue an all-points bulletin for him as well as an arrest warrant for Cowlings, and the manhunt begins. At 5 p.m., perplexed by the situation at hand, Kardashian and another of Simpson's defense lawyers read Simpson's public letter in a press conference. Many would interpret the letter as a suicide note, and the lawyers confirmed that they and Simpson's psychiatrist agree with this interpretation of the note as a suicide letter. Shapiro would even plead with Simpson during the press conference to surrender peacefully to law enforcement. In the letter, Simpson sent greetings to 24 individual friends and wrote, "First, everyone understand I had nothing to do with Nicole's murder." He then went on to describe the tumultuous relationship that he shared with Nicole and explain their decision not to reconcile their relationship. The letter went on to plead that, as a last wish with the media, they not bother his children. He even took the time to directly address his current girlfriend in the letter, apologized by saying, "I'm sorry, we're not going to have our chance. As I leave, you'll be in my thoughts." Simpson even went as far as to include an apology to the Goldman family and a statement that he could no longer go on with his life after the tragedy that had occurred. Simpson concluded with the sentiment, "Don't feel sorry for me. I have had a great life and great friends. Please think of the real OJ, not this lost person." Upon hearing the conclusion of the letter, Simpson's mother collapsed. And at 5:51, Simpson reportedly called 911 from his cell phone while riding in the backseat of Cowlings' White Bronco. He claimed that he was armed and suicidal, and the call was traced to the Santa Ana Freeway near Lake Forest, California. After Kardashian and Shapiro's press conference and the news of the 911 call, the thousands of reporters would join in the search to find Simpson. News helicopters dispatched to find Cowlings' White Bronco, which is identical to the one that was in Simpson's driveway. And around 6:20 p.m., a motorist in Orange County notified the California Highway Patrol after seeing someone they believed to be Simpson riding in a Bronco headed north on the I-5 freeway. Tracing calls made by Simpson from the car and relying on sightings of the Bronco by various motorists and police officers, Cowlings' Bronco and Simpson were located. It was Officer Ruth Dixon who was among the first to catch up with the Bronco around 6:45 p.m. Cowlings called out to her from an open window that Simpson was in the back seat with a gun to his head, and she backed off, but continued to follow the vehicle at 35 miles an hour. Up to 20 police cars would join her in this low-speed pursuit of the Bronco, and the first news helicopter to catch up to Simpson was Zoe Tour of KCBS-TV after colleagues heard that the FBI had tracked Simpson's mobile phone. 9 news helicopters would eventually join in on the chase, and it would go for so long that one of these helicopters would run out of fuel, and its station would be forced to ask another for the camera feed. live coverage of the chase would be broadcast over every major and local news outlet, and it was watched by an estimated 95 million viewers live, surpassing viewership of that year's Super Bowl, which had received 90 million viewers earlier that year. On NBC, coverage of Game 5 of the NBA Finals between the New York Knicks and Houston Rockets at Madison Square Garden continued in a small box in the corner of the screen, while anchor Tom Brokaw covered the chase live. On ABC, anchors Peter Jennings and Barbara Walters covered the chase on behalf of the station's 5 news magazines, and received some of their highest ever ratings during that week. Not only was the chase being broadcast across the United States, it was also broadcast internationally, with viewers as far as France and China seeing the coverage on television. Citizens of Los Angeles not watching the television coverage poured out of their homes and onto overpasses, creating a festival-like atmosphere. They waved signs urging Simpson to flee and chanting, "Go, OJ, go," the slogan from his Hertz commercials. Law enforcement attempted to use this media coverage to plead with Simpson to turn himself over. Knowing that Cowlings was listening to KNX-AM, the sports announcer Pete Arbogast called Simpson's former USC football coach John McKay and connected him with Simpson. Both men wept over the phone, and finally OJ told McKay, "Okay, coach, I won't do anything stupid, I promise," off the air. Arbogast believes ardently that it was John McKay who kept OJ from committing suicide in the back of the Bronco that day. McKay and other football legends, including Walter Payton and Vince Evans, also pleaded with OJ over the radio not to commit suicide and turn himself over to the police. Finally, Detective Tom Lang was able to get a hold of OJ on his cell phone, and after a long conversation, Simpson asked Lang to just let me get to the house, and Cowlings is heard pleading with Simpson to surrender peacefully at the end of the chase. Before turning himself over to police, Simpson demanded that he be allowed to speak with his mother. And when the chase ended at 8 p.m. with the Bronco in front of the house, his son Jason ended up running outside, gesturing wildly, surrounded by the 27 SWAT officers awaiting OJ's arrival. OJ remained in the Bronco for about 45 minutes after arriving to the house, and eventually exited the car at 8:50 p.m., a framed family photo in hand. He went inside the mansion for about an hour. Police spokesman stated that he spoke with his mother while inside and even drank a glass of orange juice, which made reporters laugh. Once Shapiro arrived, Simpson surrendered to the authorities only a few minutes later. In the Bronco, police found $8,000 in cash, a change of clothing, a loaded .357 Magnum, a United States passport, family pictures, and a disguise kit, complete with a fake goatee and a mustache. Simpson was then booked at the Parker Center, which is LAPD headquarters, and taken back to the men's central jail. Cowlings was booked on suspicion of harboring a fugitive and held on $250,000 bail. 3 days later, on June 20th, Simpson was arraigned and pleaded not guilty to both murders, and he was held without bail. The following day, a grand jury is called to determine whether or not to indict Simpson on the 2 murders. On June 21st, a grand jury was called to determine whether or not to indict Simpson on the murders, but it was dismissed only 2 days later. Prosecutors worried that the excessive media coverage could have influenced the neutrality of this grand jury and decided to hold a probable cause hearing instead to determine whether or not they could bring Simpson to trial. California Superior Court Judge Kathleen Kennedy Powell ruled on July 7th that there was sufficient evidence to bring Simpson to trial for the murders. At his second arraignment on July 22nd, when Simpson was asked how he pleaded to the murder charges, Simpson firmly stated, absolutely, 100% not guilty. Interesting testimony did come up during the grand jury trial, even though it was short. For instance, Jill Shively, a neighbor of Nicole's, mentioned that she saw a white Ford Bronco speeding away from Bundy Drive in such a hurry that it almost collided with a Nissan at the intersection of Bundy and San Vicente Boulevard. She also said that she recognized Simpson's voice. But it was learned that she talked to a television show called Hard Copy for $5,000. And after that, prosecutors declined to use her testimony at the actual trial. A similar story emerged from Jose Camacho of Ross Cutlery, who provided store receipts that showed Simpson had purchased a 12-inch stiletto knife only 6 weeks before the murders. This knife was recovered and determined to be similar to the one that the coroner said caused the stab wounds on both of the victims. But the prosecution refused to present this evidence at trial because Camacho sold his story to the National Enquirer for $12,500. Tests on the knife determined that an oil used on new cutlery was still present on the knife and indicated it had never been used, so it ended up not being the murder weapon. In the days following the murders, former NFL player and pastor Rosie Greer visited Simpson in the Los Angeles County Jail. A jailhouse guard named Jeff Stewart testified to Judge Ito that at one point Simpson had yelled to Greer during his visit that he didn't mean to do it, after which Greer had urged Simpson to come clean and admit to the crime. Unfortunately for the prosecution, Ito ruled that the evidence of this conversation was inadmissible to court because it was protected under clergy penitent privilege. In the wake of Simpson's arrest and the decision to move forward with trial, the media went into a frenzy, something that not only worried the judge and prosecution in terms of an impartial jury pool, but also interfered with their personal lives. Prosecutors Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden were not only facing scrutiny by the press and greater public for their role in the case, but also for their appearance. People magazine would eventually report that they were in support of a change of Marcia Clark's hairstyle partway through the trial, but then they would recommend that she wear more fitted suits and tailored skirts during court proceedings. But not only was the consideration of media coverage speculating about the case important for all of the parties to consider, the question of whether or not the media would be allowed into the courtroom during the trial was also a major point of contention. The decision to allow media into the courtroom was heavy on the mind of Judge Lance Ito. He's the judge who will preside over the trial. Among the many decisions Judge Ito would have to make regarding this trial, the question of cameras in the courtroom was one of the first he had to consider. He had to decide whether live camera coverage was warranted, or if only members of the press being present would satisfy the needs of the media and public interest in the case. Ito's decision will forever be scrutinized by legal experts and laymen alike, as many believed that his choice to allow live camera coverage to be a great cause of scrutiny and eventually public ridicule for many of the figures in this case, such as prosecutor Marcia Clark, Detective Mark Furman, and witness Cato Kalin, all of which we will discuss in Part 2. But jury selection was the next major item of consideration for Judge Ito, and as early as October of 1994, he began to interview potential jurors in the quest for a fair trial. 304 prospective jurors were instructed to fill out a 75-page questionnaire, and then on November 3rd, 12 jurors were seated with 12 alternates. Over the course of the trial, 10 of the original 12 jurors would be dismissed for a variety of reasons, one of which was Jeanette Harris, dismissed by Judge Ito after he learned she had not disclosed the fact that she'd experienced an instance of domestic abuse. But we will get into the intricacies of jury dismissals in Part 2. The prosecution and defense exhaustively researched and attempted to predict the best makeup of a juror for this case. Prosecutor Marcia Clark believed that all women, regardless of race, would sympathize with Nicole, especially after hearing testimony about the domestic abuse that she faced at the hands of OJ. The defense favored female jurors as well, but argued that black women would not be sympathetic to Nicole, who was a white woman, due to the tensions over interracial marriage at the time. In the end, both sides disproportionately favored female jurors, and of the original jury pool of 40% white, 28% black, 17% Hispanic, and 15% Asian jurors, the final jury brought to trial had 10 women and 2 men. of whom 9 were black, 2 white, and 1 was Hispanic. With the jury selected, the cases assembled, and cameras at the ready, the People versus Orenthal James Simpson was set to begin with opening statements on January 24th, 1995. And it is on that date that we will pick up in Part 2 of Law and Disorder's coverage of the O.J. Simpson trial.
Thanks to Anna Muckenfoos for writing, researching, and sharing today's program, and as always, to Christopher Mitchell, our Manager of Digital Content and Strategy, for producing. And many thanks to you for listening to this episode of Law and Disorder, a Precinct 444 podcast from the National Law Enforcement Museum. We hope you enjoyed this episode and will join us again for Part 2 of The People versus O.J. Simpson. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. And we would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444 at nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 E Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org, and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.